David Hellard might just be one of the most interesting people I've ever met. He's a former competitive trail runner and commentator for Eurosport, as well as the Golden Trail World Series. He's also host of the Bad Boy Running podcast, where he has casual pub-style conversations with other runners. The real reason I brought him on the show, though, was to talk about Caffeine, a brand that he started to give runners an option for a caffeinated chew that's quickly absorbed without the need for a gel. Caffeine is widely considered a legal performance enhancer, and I love that the quick hit of energy it provides can make a hard run feel easier. As much as I love my morning cup of coffee, it just doesn't sit well with me on the run, and neither do gels with caffeine in them. Today, I'll chat with David about how and why caffeine works to improve running performance, and how you can fit caffeine of any kind into your fueling strategy if you don't already, or if you struggle to find something that works like I do. So let's get into it. It's not every day that I'm joined by a fellow podcaster, but excited to have host of the Bad Boy Running podcast here with me, David Hellard. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Super excited. Thanks for having me on. It's my first Canadian podcast, and can't wait.
Well, I'd say that you are our first English host, but one of our coaches, Haley, is actually from England. So I'll say you're the first external interview I've done who's from England.
Oh, Haley, you've ruined it for me. Haley, why? Cut my mustard.
If it makes you feel any better, she's recently converted from the roads to the trails, so she's a full member of the club now.
Oh, fantastic. She's seen the light.
All right, we kind of just nudge on it a little, mentioning that you're really into trail running, but I'd love for you to give for our listeners just an overview of how you describe yourself as a runner. I know you're an entrepreneur, a podcaster, a runner, so how would you want people to describe you?
I mean, if I was actually to describe myself as a runner currently, it's barely running at all, because I've got a 9-month-old, and he's just ill all the time, which means I'm ill all the time, and I've barely got out the door in the last month. But because I've been running for so long and it's become my life and my business, I guess I wear a lot of hats, is how I describe it. So I present the Golden Trail World Series, commentate for it on Eurosport and on 100 channels around the world. But then I'm founder of Caffeine Bullet, which is a caffeine product specifically created for running. But have a podcast, Bad Boy Running Podcast, that's been running since 2015, and then do a host of other things as well linked to running, whether it's hosting the ultra stage at there's the Boston Run Show this year, but also at the UK Run Show, and pretty much, I don't know if you have the same thing in Canada where there's networks of faces, but I've been one of those people that you just see at stuff where it was running for years and been like, who's that guy? Why is he always around? That's basically been my life. And while I was a reasonable runner for about 8 years or so, that stopped pre-COVID with an injury, and then since recovery, getting old and lack of motivation and time to actually, well, I guess realization that I'm never going to prioritize training hard enough to get back to the level that in my head I was. So I'm quite content now just to enjoy running and still train the odd session hard, because I enjoy those sessions, but realistically I don't think I'm ever going to see a PB unless I run a 2.5 mile race or come up with some wacky thing that I've never done before. Otherwise every day's a battle to just try and be anywhere near as fast as my ego would want me to be, basically.
So when you say not a bad runner, though, you have some pretty impressive results. I think you've won many local or even international races in your prime, is that right?
Yeah, I think my record on paper is a lot better than my ability, than my actual ability. Because I've always been drawn to the story, partly as a journalist, partly because of the podcast, it's meant that, and also the excitement of, I think, doing a first race in a new country is, for me, is one of the greatest experiences in running, because seeing the impact that has on a country, the transformational effect it can have. So I've often entered races where the level of competition isn't necessarily as high as the result may suggest. So I was Somaliland marathon champion, which is the home of Mo Farah. I've raced in Afghanistan, won in where else? Burma, and various marathons in the UK and obstacle races and stuff. But I think if I was to take my ability then and race now, like the strength and depth of running globally now has massively changed. And so I'd be happy with kind of championship starts now and things like that. But I guess we all have different goals, and my goals were creating fun stories and experiences, and I'd much rather come first in something that was going to be a great story to tell one day than come 10th with a far better time in a high caliber race, which is the reverse of most people, which was good for me because it allowed me to then do well in those races.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you said you are obviously balancing your training with a busy life and kids, but do you have any running goals right now or any kind of wonky races that you're gunning for?
I've really got nothing, but the first time in my life where it almost feels selfish to be training now, because I'm away from my son and away from my wife, and she wants to be fit as well. But the beer lovers with the craft half is I quite like running in. That's another thing I do. Sorry, I get sidetracked. I also put on races under the guise of beer belly running. So we put on things like the Let's Get Shit Raced, the Great British Beerathon, and so there's something called the Craft Half, which is a half marathon with beers on the way around, raising money for Street Child, who amazing organisation. And so that's now in my diary. So that's my new target race, and just surviving that, probably surviving the drinking of that, because as much as I've reduced my running, I've absolutely stopped socialising and drinking at all compared to what I used to. So I think both of those are going to be a challenge for me. Next year, I'm hoping once life is more stable, I can get back into training. I'd love to do a 100-mile race sometime, but in my head I'm almost telling myself it's probably going to be waiting until they're 10 years old and I could go and do a Sunday run without interrupting family life. That will be the first time that I can really start to have some goals that I'd be motivated by or proud of the results. So that seems a long way off, but I'm sure it's going to appear a lot quicker than I hoped for.
Yeah, and any chance that any of those goal races end up being in Canada? I know Sulphur Springs has recently added a 100-mile. We have the Great Canadian Death Race. There's some good longer ones.
Yeah, to be honest, I'd love for the Golden Trail to go there, because there are some really good Canadian athletes, and it's constantly moving. It seems to be in North America focused on California at the moment, but I'd love to go and race. I mean, you guys have got such vast wilderness and incredible peaks, so I'd love to do something like that. But typically when my wife and I, when we've travelled previously, because when I was running in Myanmar, she raced there as well, and in fact we got engaged at the finish line of Comrades ultramarathon, and so Canada is one of our destinations that we both want to go to. So I know when we go there, it won't be a 100-miler because that would ruin the holiday, but we'll certainly do a race of some sort while we're out there. I'd imagine a city half or a city marathon, but we can tie in some trail race or something and actually get into the middle of nowhere. That'd be amazing.
I love it. Well, I'll put in a plug for the Toronto Waterfront Marathon in October. It's a phenomenal race if you're looking for a road run.
Oh, fantastic. I'll put it on the list.
Yeah, definitely. So I know the main focus for today is going to be on caffeine, primarily because you started your own business, Caffeine Bullet, which, by the way, fantastic supplements. Like I take the chews they are mainly before my runs. They're so quick to absorb, so easy to digest. I'd love to know what started you thinking about wanting to start that business in the first place.
It very much a need, because when I used to race, at the time, this would have been around kind of 2010 through to 2016, 17. There were caffeine gels, but actually often I wouldn't want a caffeine gel when I needed my caffeine, and I've always used caffeine through the latter half of a race as a pick-me-up rather than starting off with it. And so I'd had a few race experiences where previously what I'd do is I'd cut out these things called Pro Plus, which are caffeine pills, and I'd tuck a strip beneath my watch, and during the race then pop those. And they were all quite frustrating and bitty. And then I was racing through the Sahara Desert and reached for my pill, popped it, and actually lost it in the sand, which is when I had that aha moment of like, surely there must be a product that is out there that you don't have to take a gel to get the caffeine, particularly if I was doing tempo runs, interval sessions, or even at the end of long runs when I was tired. I didn't want to take a gel just to get that kick, because you just don't need carbohydrates for those distances. And that's when I did a Kickstarter and started researching into the science behind caffeine, and it then made sense to do a chew because you then got buccal and sublingual absorption. But also I've been doing startups for a while. At the time I was co-founded a business called zipcube.com, which was Airbnb for meeting rooms, which is still going in Europe. I don't think it's not been so successful it's made it out to Canada. And so at that stage we'd raised money, the company was doing well, but it was obvious that my founder and co-founder shouldn't be leading a business together. And so that's when I thought, actually, why don't I do something I really love rather than a startup for the sake of doing something because it's not a corporate job. And so went all in on Caffeine Bullet basically, and haven't really looked back since. So I have looked back, but I've looked back with very, very strange phrase. I've looked back loads. I've always looked back and loved it, thinking I'm over here. Yes. what a good decision.
Yeah, I'm curious how you use them personally, because I often take them before my runs. I love getting that kick early morning before I go, and I find if I have a cup of coffee, it just kind of sloshes around. But it sounds like you actually enjoy taking them mid-run. So how is it that either when you were still racing world championships or even now that you like to use the product?
Well, because right now I'm drinking a decaf coffee, and I would never take caffeine before races. I would if I was going for like a track meet or a cross country. And if I was training, I'd typically take them in tempo runs. For me, I really like the way caffeine, it gives you that surge, and so it's good for motivation. If I couldn't be asked to do a training session, that's when I'd take one to give me that energized feeling to actually make sure I got out the door. But I'd much rather start feeling my normal self and ease my way into a session, or a tempo run, knowing that I've got that kick to come. And for me, that's what my preferred way of using caffeine and Caffeine Bullet, because particularly I don't know if you've had training sessions where, say you're doing a marathon program and you keep on increasing your tempo miles each week, and you come to dread the Thursday where you're thinking, I've got to do 8 miles at marathon pace now. And you remember that 3 weeks ago you were doing like 4 miles at marathon pace, and that was tough. So having the caffeine there, I wouldn't use it every week because it's good sometimes to train yourself to have to brute your way through it. But knowing that you've got that kick to come, because it's absorbed so quickly and it takes 5 minutes. And so it means you can start with confidence. And actually, the second half gets exciting because you suddenly think, right, it's coming. And I play a game where it's like, let's hold off for as long as we can, needing to take it. And it almost ekes out. It makes the session go past faster. But that when it comes, it's almost like you're in the Fast and the Furious. You've pressed that button. You're like, right, well, let's watch this clock. It's time to absolutely blow the bloody doors off this thing. So I typically use it like that. If I was going on for a long run, I'd have it in my back pocket more as a just in case if I can't be asked, or if actually I'm just a bit more tired than possible. But racing, I'd use it. 5k PB, I had one maybe 15 minutes before, one kind of half a mile in to get that step change. But something like the ultra marathon, Comrades Ultra, where it's 90 kilometers or 92 kilometers, 4,000 meters up, 2 down. 4 down, 2 up. That's where I changed it again, because you always want to be layering your caffeine, so you're increasing the dose, or you're increasing the amount in your system. And so I actually started off, I didn't take any, and I'd only have it when I was starting to feel tired, or in a marathon, when you start to lose pace, which sometimes, if it's going badly, that could be 14 miles. Sometimes it could be 18, 19 miles. And so because it's quick to respond, it means that you don't actually have to tie yourself to a strategy. You can use it responsively, and that's when I'd have, like in Comrades, I'd have a half, then I'd have one, then I'd have a one slightly closer, and then I'd finish with 2. I wouldn't recommend everyone does that because that's a lot of caffeine, but it's so personal to your absorption rate and what you're used to as well, your tolerance. So that's typically how I'd use it throughout my training, my racing. But I know some people I won't say the amount on air because it's it's an irresponsible amount, but who've done, it's called the Great Elm Canal Race in the UK, Birmingham to London, I think, where they took 3 times the amount I'd normally recommend people take, but then it took them hours. And so that's partly why I'm here to explain about caffeine, because it's so individual to people that there is no right way, because we all respond so differently.
Yeah, there's definitely no right way. I do like that idea of keeping it almost as like either a fail-safe if things are going wrong, or that extra little kick even if things are going well near the finish.
Yeah, completely, because caffeine, it stimulates them. Most people know about the mind and not necessarily the body. And so you can use it for the physical effects. And physiologically what it does is it reduces, in the liver, it releases fat cells that can then be used as a fuel source. So that's useful because it then preserves your glycogen stores. And so actually it increases endurance by up to 6%. But it does a whole host of other things as well, where it acts like an endorphin, it acts like adrenaline as well. And so it reduces the perception of pain, it reduces the perception of fatigue. And both those things mean you can actually push harder for longer. Most people know that it increases alertness as well, and focus. And so all these elements act in different ways at different times for people. And so you can take caffeine to get that endurance early, or if you really want to get that mental push, that's when you can use it in the second half of a race really effectively.
David, I'd love to know about a very specific use case, in part because I know you mentioned wanting to do or having done a half marathon with a lot of beer involved. And I also happened to stumble onto your bio and noticed that you've actually placed 12th in the Beer Mile World Championships, which, as a Canadian, I know a thing or two about because we tend to place highly. But I'd love to know, how does caffeine interact with beer, and is that something that you would recommend?
Actually, I'm trying to think if I know much about that. I don't think it actually interacts with alcohol per se, or if it does, I've not seen many studies on it. And but I know that when someone has a drunk, for example, on their hands, they'll often give them caffeine and think that will help with the hangover, or that will actually sober them up. It won't. It will just give you a more energized drunk, which might be what you need to get them moving so that they're not falling asleep in the nightclub. But I'm sure it does have an impact in some way, but it's not something I've studied extensively. I was trying to convince the founder of Brewdog to do a partnership with us for a caffeine bullet beer, but there's quite heavy restrictions on alcohol and caffeine together in the UK because of it kind of is like rocket fuel combining the two. But the interesting thing about, partly that's because of the way caffeine and sugar interplays, and that's something people need to be really aware of. And what caffeine can do, what it does is it also increases your insulin response. And so most people know about sugar crashes, where you take on sugar, your insulin shoots up, and that then brings down your blood sugar levels. Now, if you're taking a strong dose of caffeine, it shoots up your insulin as well. The chances are you're probably using gels anyway, so you've already got that spike. So if you then start taking caffeine and stop taking carbohydrates when you're racing, what we often see is that people have this big sugar crash as well, because the combination of insulin spike. And one of the challenges with taking gels is being able to take it all the way through the end of a race. But also caffeine, typically you take more at the end of a race as well. And so it's essential that you, even if you don't feel like you need carbohydrates, once you've taken caffeine, that you actually continue taking whatever your carbohydrate source is, because you're then likely to have not really a caffeine crash. Most caffeine crashes are actually sugar crashes, but that can happen pretty badly in things like ultra races, but also longer lasting marathons if you're not managing to top up your energy source.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the idea of using them in tandem with gels, because I think a lot of runners know about the idea of needing to top up your glycogen stores and get more carbohydrates as you run. But I'm curious about the concept of taking in more caffeine during the run, and this was actually a conversation I had recently with a friend because we both really love the product, is the idea of, do you need to take more caffeine if you're running more? Obviously, you don't burn it off the same way as you do carbohydrates, but do you have a greater tolerance, or should you be upping your caffeine intake for a longer run? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so caffeine is such a weird drug. It's basically got a half-life, which is the length it stays in your system. So the best, if you think of a curve of how strong a dose it is in your system, if you're swallowing caffeine, studies have shown that drinks, pills, gels typically start to kick in 15 minutes. They'll peak at about up to 55 minutes, and then they'll last at that peak from 45 minutes to an hour. And so if you're having a coffee or taking a caffeine pill before you race, you want to be taking it quite early so that you then get that peak during the time you need it. If you're chewing caffeine, or if you're taking it sublingually like a strip, that curve is accelerated. So it starts to kick in kind of 5-10 minutes, it peaks in 25, and it will then stay at a similar level for the kind of 45 minutes and an hour. So when you're racing, you've got that 45-minute window of peak caffeine. But if you're racing for longer than 45 minutes, then you obviously want to ensure that you can extend that for as long as possible. Now, the way the body works, one of the ways it keeps you alert is by caffeine is the same shape as a chemical called adenosine. And adenosine, when it attaches to your brain, makes you feel sleepy. And so it blocks adenosine attaching to your brain. And so when caffeine starts to wear off and leaves your system, you've still got all this adenosine built up, and it then almost floods back in. So you need to keep your caffeine level topped up to stop that happening. And the frustrating thing about scientific studies, there hasn't actually been scientific research on dual doses of caffeine, but everything I've seen in performance of the athletes we've monitored, you need to increase the level of dose of caffeine to get that extended effect. So if you take a cup of coffee of 100 milligrams, and your second coffee never feels the same during the day, and the same when you're racing. So actually you need to increase the level of dosage you have in your system to be able to keep on firing in the way you are. You can do that potentially by having the same dose of caffeine but in a shorter time period. So we've said it's 45 minutes to an hour to peak. So if you're having within 45 minutes the same dose of caffeine, actually that's going to mean that those peaks overlap, and so you increase the total level of caffeine in your system. One thing, so when I would race, I'd always have an approximate caffeine strategy of, say it was caffeine bullet, I'd have a marathon, I'd have one at maybe miles 16 to 18, and then I'd have one or two when I was either next feeling tired or thinking I'm close enough to home that I just want to close this out with like a hard finish. And same with ultras, I'd think of ways of increasing dosage. And same with your gels. If you've got something like a goo gel, which is 30 milligrams, 50 milligrams, just think about how often you can take those, and you will take those, and think of those curves adding up. Are you going to have enough caffeine to see through to the finish? And is it increasing the doses? So don't start with your strongest caffeine. And that's the challenge of gels and of energy chews, is that people tend to take on less and less carbohydrates as they race. And so if you've got the same caffeine source, it means you're actually going to take on less and less caffeine. Because even though we all think, I'll take 6 gels for the race, the 6th one is the one you don't take. You always take that first one. Something else to note as well is the optimal dose of caffeine is massive. And so studies have shown, over 50 studies have shown, the optimal dose is between 3 and 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo that you weigh, which is huge. So for someone like myself, that's 210 milligrams as a bottom, up to double that, 420. I've found for myself around 5 milligrams is my optimal dose. That's like 210, that's 3 cans of Red Bull. It's a crazy amount, really. So we're not going to do that when we're training. We might not even do that in our A races. The good news is that studies have also shown that 1 milligram is what it takes for an ergogenic effect. And so ergogenic means a sporting effect in essence. And so when you're racing, have that in mind. Whatever you weigh in kilograms, that is the level of caffeine that you'll need to get actually a decent kick. So if you look at things like, say, a pack of shot blocks, you need to have a whole pack of shot blocks, maybe even more, to get to that effect. Some gels, if you've got the 30 milligram, 50 milligram gels, they're not going to get you there. So you've got to think about layering those to get to your minimum dose to get the proper responsive effect you need. So it's quite mathematical if you start analysing it. Something else to bear in mind as well, this is where it becomes super complex. That half-life, so we've talked about it stays in your bloodstream at a high level for an hour, or 45 minutes to an hour. The half-life is, after that amount of time, you've then got half the dose of caffeine that you took at the beginning in your system. So say you took one chew, 100 milligrams, the half-life for most people is 4 to 5 hours. Because it's chewed and it's in your system quicker, we take that off the front end, so you're looking at like 3.5, 4.5 hours. So in 4 hours' time, you've still got 50 milligrams of caffeine in your system. Now, for some people, that none of this is true, because 10% of people, or it was actually 8% in a metadata study of a study of studies, don't respond to caffeine at all. And if that's you shouldn't take it, you actually slow down. 50% respond, super responders, everyone else is above placebo. And so the absorption rate and also the rate at which you burn through your caffeine differs depending on those groups. And so for some people, that's why they can take caffeine and go to bed. Some people, they'll be up all night because the half-life of caffeine is so varied. And that kind of 4 to 5 hours is the average. Now, if, for example, you're on the contraception pill, that doubles the time of the half-life of caffeine. I don't know what it does to the absorption rate, but that means you're far less likely to sleep if you're taking caffeine and you're on the pill. If you smoke, however, not many runners do, it halves the time of your absorption rate, and various other drugs and various other factors also interplay with it. And so this is where it becomes incredibly complex, which is why we say before you race, most people know to test their gels, but actually test your caffeine and test it in different doses, because until you've done that, it's very hard to know what the impact is of repeat dosage or how quickly it's going to get out of your system. And actually, unless you know that, it's going to limit how much you use it in your training, because while it is a huge performance benefit, if it affects your sleep too much, that is obviously going to have an impact on the rest of your training. So you need to balance that out with, should you do your tempo runs, your long runs in the morning, so then you can take caffeine, so then you can perform better and still sleep. Because if you're doing a track Tuesday, you're probably not going to take a huge amount of caffeine if it takes a long time to get out of your system. So all of those things are quite important to factor in. We've talked about tolerance. Well, we haven't talked about tolerance either. Those receptors in your mind that get clogged with adenosine, or get clogged with caffeine to stop adenosine flushing in, the more caffeine you take, the more receptors your brain then grows. So that, because it wants to be tired when it's tired, because it needs to sleep. So the more caffeine we take in our lives, actually the greater the tolerance we build up. From what I've seen of various studies, I still think you get some of the physiological effects and the release of the fat cells from the liver, even if you have a tolerance built up, because they've looked at the impact on caffeine withdrawal or not, long-term caffeine withdrawal in Ironman athletes, and they showed that there was still a huge benefit to those who didn't withdraw at all versus those that did. But the less caffeine you have in your life, the more the impact of when you take caffeine, which is why I always have decaf coffee. And we actually say as a company, you should be weirdly taking less caffeine in your life, but probably more caffeine when you race. So the less you have in your life, the more the caffeine you take will impact when you do take it. That was a long answer to a question. That's the thing. It's such a fascinating topic, and most people don't understand all these different elements to be able to then figure out how to build it into their training.
And I think it's so nuanced because it's so personalized. I like that you comment on the fact that you're drinking decaf coffee, because I do think it makes total sense when you explain it, but it does seem initially like a contradiction. One thing that I'd be curious to know your thoughts on is the idea of like a caffeine taper, because you talk about how you build up this tolerance and maybe the effects are less as you drink less. So for those who haven't heard of a caffeine taper, the general principle is that you kind of lower your caffeine intake gradually leading into a race the same way you would mileage, so that in principle the effect is greater when you get to your race. Is that something that you practice, or do you think it's better to make sure that you're keeping a stable level of caffeine in your runs?
I mean, I don't need to practice it because I'll be tapering anyway, and because I drink decaf coffee, I'm not doing intense trading before, like a few days before the marathon anyway, or before my big race, and so but naturally I won't be taking caffeine. There's been mixed studies on this. There's been mixed suggestions on the right thing to do, and but also it depends how much caffeine is part of your life, because for some people, they love coffee and they're just going to continue drinking coffee because it's great, which is fair enough. If you're someone who is a heavy caffeine user, a heavy coffee drinker, withdrawing can actually give you withdrawal symptoms and give you headaches or interrupt your sleep. So if that is you, then you shouldn't cut it out. You should just keep on doing what you're doing, because losing too much sleep is going to have more of a negative impact in the build-up. But one study, the one I mentioned with the Ironman, it showed that while there was two control groups, one that cut out caffeine in the build-up and one that didn't, the one that didn't cut it out still saw a massive benefit from using caffeine. And so you don't have to cut it out and still gain some of its power. They didn't actually analyze the differences in why that was. How I'd interpreted it is that the response for the liver and some of the adrenaline response would be similar, but probably the mental response wouldn't be quite as strong. If you're trying to cut caffeine out of your system, it takes, for most people, 4 days for it to completely leave your system. If you're trying to reverse some of the long-term changes that regular caffeine instills in the body, that takes around 2 weeks at least to happen. And so if you're really wanting to get the full response, then 2 weeks is the period you should cut it out. But actually, if you love coffee and caffeine, I'd say 4 days is a good time. Something else to bear in mind is that it's incredibly hard to know how much caffeine is in a coffee. And so that's why I'd suggest to people cutting out caffeine before you race, because even one bean from the same plant in a field will have a different amount of caffeine because of the amount of sun it's received. But also, when you take that bean, how long it's dried for, how long it's roasted for, how thinly it's ground for, the pressure it goes through the cup, all these things have a massive impact on the strength of that coffee. And so you can see some coffees having 3 times the strength of others, and even in the same shop, like huge variety. And so that doesn't matter so much in your day-to-day life if you have morning coffees, but actually if you're having coffee in the build up to your race and you just you're likely to be traveling, you go into a different store or a different type of coffee, then you might be taking on something that is actually double, triple strength than what you're used to. And so it's almost a defensive move to cut out caffeine for me and coffee for me, for those reasons.
Yeah, and I think it's also one of the advantages of a product like Caffeine Bullet or even gels that do have caffeine is it's a very measured dose. Even within the Caffeine Bullet products, I notice you have Ginger Wars is one of them. They're kind of a ginger flavored chew, and they have I think it's something like 30 or 40 milligrams compared to the higher dose of the other chew. So I like using those for kind of shorter or more intense runs, or when I don't need as strong as a kick, and I like having that ability to kind of measure out how much of that caffeine effect you're getting.
Yeah, and those are actually the idea behind those, partly because, in fact, those are because of Canada, completely. I've just realised when I was filming the Obstacle Race World Champs in Canada, I tried the ginger chews. Is it Gingins, I think, or
I think Ginger Roars,
similar.
Is that right?
No, the normal chews in Canada. So the Ginger Roars is the Caffeine Bullet ones, but I tried these ginger chews. I thought these were delicious, and then when I looked into it, because of the high level of gingerol, which is the active ingredient in ginger, it's actually great for flushing the stomach, where high levels of ginger mean that it transports carbohydrates faster through your intestines and your stomach. And so when you race, that's why, well, even when you don't race, that's why ginger is a great stomach settler. So the idea behind the ginger ores is that at the point that you often want caffeine is often when your stomach's gone. And so for things like ultra races, or if you're using them when you race, for things like ultras, they're great because you can nibble on one. It settles your stomach, but also it gives you a little dose. And like Comrades, as I said, the first dose I had, I didn't want to have 100 milligrams of caffeine, because if I was then to layer up and have to keep on stacking on top of that, I'd end up taking way too much caffeine for my need. And so starting with a lower dose actually then meant I could layer more steps. But also, quite often I've found when you go out for a long run, you don't necessarily want to be in PB territory, like smashing the doors off 6 5-minute miles or whatever it is. You just need a little top up to get you home. And so that's the idea of having just something a bit more gentle. It gives you a lift, but you're not going to be there with your heart beating out your chest.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you mean, but oftentimes, like if I have an unsettled stomach or something, or just need to, something that's easy to digest, I'll have ginger ales, like a kind of pop that has some ginger in it, and I find it does kind of sit well.
But we're bringing out, at the moment, we're developing a gel, a Morton-style gel, but based off ginger, so that you'd almost have it in your arsenal, where you'd have it as your 6th or 7th, or 4th or 5th, depending on your gel strategy, just so that it eases your stomach a bit. Because one of the harshest things is, you all know, running stomach, right? And having something that actually helps you mid-race would be, with a different flavour profile as well, is the idea behind it.
So, aside from adding ginger, what are your thoughts on being able to fit in caffeine into a training program without some of the GI upset? Because I know that's a common obstacle when taking in caffeine, and it's something that I personally have really struggled with, and that's one of the reasons I appreciate Caffeine Bullet, as I found, at least as of yet, that they sit really well.
Yeah, I mean, some people just will always have issues with caffeine because their body doesn't respond to it. Some people have stomach issues with caffeine, and it's slightly different. So because a lot of the caffeine's not absorbed in your stomach, it means for some athletes they can suddenly take caffeine, but some athletes will just never be able to take it in any form, sadly, which is a real disadvantage. So even if you're that 10% of people that don't respond to caffeine, there's a chance you're never going to win the Olympics, or maybe the Olympics, because it's not necessarily the fastest runner. But yeah, that's one of the reasons as why we like this absorption mechanism, because it does bypass the stomach with a lot of the caffeine. You'll still swallow some of it. So if you're incredibly sensitive to caffeine, some will go through your stomach because you do still swallow some. But it should hopefully be a bit easier for people as well. The only challenge is, because it's absorbed so quickly, if you do have an issue with it, no matter how it gets into your system, in essence you're concertinaing all of your caffeine dose. Instead of a coffee flowing through your stomach and being absorbed as the 300 millilitres is absorbed, this is all in your 5 minutes. And so it's super fast and impactful, but if you don't respond to caffeine, and never will, you're just going to get that faster in a more pronounced way. So I'm not saying it's the absolute cure for everyone, but again, you've got to try these things to figure out and see what works for you, and sadly some people just won't ever be able to take caffeine.
And I did notice you said you're coming out with a gel upcoming that will have caffeine and ginger in it as well, but it was also part of your founding story that you found you wanted something that isolated the caffeine without the energy. What are some of your thoughts on different forms of caffeine, be it chews or gels or coffee or gum or other products, and do they work together, or is one better than the other? Would be curious to know if you think that runners benefit from just finding one that works for them, or using different strategies in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much of nutrition is about what you like, and it very much depends on the nature of the race, though. because if you're an ultra runner, quite often you want to have a selection of flavours and of nutrition, just because you just never know how you're going to be feeling. And even like Courtney DeWalter, when I interviewed her in February, she was saying that she'll nail her nutrition and suddenly the next race she won't want that at all. I think she had pizza at one of them and she thought it was delicious, and then suddenly she couldn't stomach it. And so having variety is always useful. What I would say is always just think about the profile of how long it takes to absorb, because you would use it in a different way. And so your gums and your chews, you can use far more responsively, because if you're halfway through a race and you start to tire, you can still take them, and you know that you're not going to lose a mile or two dying out your arse while you're waiting for it to kick in. And so if you are using gels, you need to almost schedule them in defensively, anticipating when you'll be tired, and then think about how long it takes for the kick to make sure that you are ensuring you won't tire. We're not actually going to do a caffeine gel, because I personally believe in separating them, and that's partly because I've done races before where I've taken my gel and then I've suddenly thought I need my caffeine now, and I've not been able to take it for another 20 minutes because I knew if I took an additional gel it was going to overload my stomach, and so I was suddenly stuck waiting for that all that time, and it was this horrible feeling because I was just so frustrated that there wasn't another option. I think the reality though of things like gels is you're never going to use it for a 5k, for a 1500 meters, probably never going to use it for a track session, for a tempo session. You might use it for a long run, but actually it still feels quite weird to take out on a training run. And so that's where having a gum or a strip or if you're a cyclist, stopping for a coffee, nothing more delightful. So I definitely think it's good to have variety, and particularly if you're doing longer runs and you're layering, it's good to have just different flavour profiles so that you don't get sick of one. But I think there are many good sources of caffeine, but for me it's just not gels. I just don't think they're responsive, and actually it's the most likely thing you're not going to consume in a race.
When you say it's the most likely thing to not consume in a race, is that just because of the stomach upset and trying to get in the extra calories, or is there another issue you see with putting caffeine in gels?
It's not putting the caffeine in the gel that's the issue. I think it's more that because you take caffeine at the end of the race, that's when you're more likely to have the stomach issue, but also you've got flavour burn. And it's only really since Morton came out that neutral flavour's been a concept, and they're still not that neutral, they're still pretty sweet. And so that's, if you're linking your caffeine to an experience that you've already had 6 of or 7 of, that's the danger, is that you may not want another one of those things, whatever it may be. If you were having 20 chews that were like Starburst chews and you then had a caffeine bullet, that would be exactly the same thing. Or if you were using chewing gum for your energy, some magical chewing gum sauce, I'd say the same. Or if you were drinking all your calories and you then had a caffeine drink, it would be that same issue. But having an alternative mechanism of caffeine, I think, is extremely useful.
You talk about Morton being kind of a more neutral flavor, and I notice even for the caffeine bullet flavors, they're quite good tasting. You have the mint and the chocolate orange, I believe, but they do err on the side of neutral. Do you have any plans to add new flavors or anything that's really bold or different?
We tried. In fact, I've got. I don't know if it's good or bad to turn around. We've got boxes of stuff behind me. I'm in real trouble with my wife. I think you can see them there in the corner. One of the troubles is we just can't find anything that works because caffeine's brutally bitter. And if you've ever had a really bad coffee, a really bad espresso, that bitterness that's the caffeine. But also we taste it so differently that some people almost find it deafeningly loud, the taste of caffeine bitterness. And so if you look at some of our reviews, most people think the chocolate orange is unbelievably tasty, but some people just think it tastes of arse because they can't turn off. They they're basically super tasters. They'd be very good wine sommeliers. And so we've always tried, we've had to create products with reviews in mind, knowing that it's not the number of 5-star reviews that make you a success, it's the lack of 1-star reviews on things like Amazon now. So we've tried and we've tried. We've not actually found. We've got some brain bullets coming out in about a month and a half time, but the intention of those is, so there'll be different flavors, but the intention of those is they're not sporting. They've got L-theanine in, and they're very much more for focus. So those are caramental, and they're a mental mint matcha. But I think the only other flavour we found that worked was black licorice and blackcurrant. But because North America don't have a relationship with licorice in the way Europe does, we didn't think it would be a flavour worth launching. And we're yet to find something else that actually works well with it. If there's any food scientists out there, the great thing about mint is it almost tricks the brain so that you're not listening to the caffeine. The good thing about the chocolate, it's a light chocolate, but it then turns it into a dark chocolate with a bitterness. Your mind almost thinks it's this more adult chocolate than it is. So we just haven't had the ability to create something. So if anyone's got an idea for something that you think would work, or you've found other flavours that go with caffeine in strong doses, then please message me, David, at what am I, silverbullet@caffeinebullet.com. But yeah, the challenge is because we're putting so much caffeine into such a small vehicle, we just don't have the flexibility to be able to succeed with many flavours, unfortunately.
Would be curious to know on the flavor side, is there any flavor you've come up with that just utterly failed and tasted disgusting? Or maybe on the other side, is there anything, maybe even if it hasn't been tried yet, that you would love to see as a flavor, even if it's just a concept?
I mean, the flavours that don't work, there really are loads of them. Any fruit flavour just gets demolished by it. We've tried ginger, we tried bitter lemon. One that almost worked was like an apple custard crumble that we just kept on throwing extra things in, seeing if it would twist it up. But I mean, I'm always trying to get in the headspace of what it's like, what you want when you're at mile 18 or 17. So you almost want something completely different to all the other flavours out there. That's the real challenge, is what's different. I've always loved Talk Gels, and they have things like cherry yogurt, and but for me, I think cheesecake is my favourite thing on earth. So, or even like lasagna, I don't know how it could work, but I think something super savoury could be great in a gel if your mind could get in that headspace, like chips and gravy. I don't know if that's well, for you guys, like poutine would be amazing. Like getting poutine and gravy. Is it called poutine?
It's poutine, or poutine. If you say it the Quebecois way, where they speak more French, they kind of put an emphasis on it. It's poutine.
Poutine. So like a poutine kind of flavour would be, with loads of umami. That would be incredible to do. I don't know how popular it would be outside of Canada. Maybe in the north of England, they love chips and gravy, so...
I was going to say, even these flavor suggestions, this feels like a very trail runner mindset to gravitate towards something savory or salty, because it's more a road runner on shorter races. I feel like it's always something sweet. So for a Canadian flavor, I was going to say, if you did a maple syrup one, I feel like that could be quite tasty.
Yeah, absolutely. We were thinking of doing a caramel maple syrup combination for one of our chews. And again, sadly the sweetness doesn't overcome the bitterness. It just makes a sweet bitter. It's like pouring sugar into that burnt coffee. It's not as bad, but you can't escape the pain.
I'm intrigued by the whole idea of it. It's there's so many interesting flavors of gels out there. I'd love to see that make its way into other different types of supplements. Yeah,
absolutely, and you're right. Like trail running flavors are more varied because you can't have that flavor. You can't allow flavor burn to persist for so long. But I do get the sense that the next generation of products are now trying to almost be a little bit wacky, a little bit unusual, trying to get people's attention. And so we've had like shandies and things like that as flavours. You obviously saw the awesome sauce that was really big in Spring Energy until a controversy came out about the lack of carbs in it. But it does feel like people are now trying to make real food flavours rather than make it more a flavour that we associate with candy.
Yeah, before we wrap up, I'd be curious, and maybe flavor's one of them, but even aside from that, are there any other innovations in the supplement space that you would love to see?
Well, I mean, we've got a massive amount of them coming out in the next, few years. We're hoping to bring out an electrolyte chew, a heavily electrolyte chew that it's almost like as good as pickle juice, but in a chew form. We have got one product we're trying to develop, but we can't get the flavour right for, I can't say too much about it because it will reveal too much, but like an AG1 Athletics Green. The bicarb thing by Morton's brilliant. The fact they've managed to master that is really quite impressive. But there are quite a few studies out there still that haven't been fully researched yet. I think one of the challenges is that the scientific studies are often, when they find something, it's quite hard to believe the paper itself because the numbers of people involved are so small. And also, if it's only been found to be true in one paper, often it then comes down to, do you trust this academic who obviously it's wonderful if they can find something to be really positive. The beetroot nitrates is obviously potentially massively influential on athletes who aren't quite elite level. Doesn't seem to do the same for elite, but we're hoping to do something in that area as well, because it's such an easy gain for people. If you're not training kind of 70 plus miles a week, then it's almost certainly going to help your performance. But there do seem to be a lot of potential avenues that still need research. But for me, actually, what I'd love to see is, when we become bigger, is to actually have scientific studies on repeat doses of caffeine, because even what I've said is based off the experience I've been exposed to through the brand and through the athletes I've worked with or kind of raced alongside or commentated alongside. But there haven't been studies in how caffeine, how it's best used in repeat dosage. You know, we've talked about that optimal caffeine rate, but that's just a one hit of caffeine. And so I'd love to be able to do tests on that. I'd love to also to be able to do tests on the understanding when we have the caffeine withdrawal or not, and the caffeine fast. Why is it that one study shows it's beneficial and one doesn't? And they both look like good studies. And like, what is being able to actually research the different ways it does impact you on those. But yeah, I think there are some quite cool potential findings around the corner. And actually, now that there's so many more brands out there, I think the big difference we'll find the next 5-10 years is that suddenly all the nutrition that was only available to those elites that went out and searched it and almost created it for themselves will be coming to the mass market pretty quickly. And as soon as a study is released, that interesting findings, you know, I know we read everything and we're thinking, right, how can we improve on this? So it's, as with all things now, with shoes, it does seem that the general public will be able to live the elite lifestyle very quickly.
Yeah, I think a lot of those are super cool ideas. The idea of being able to get a lot of your electrolytes or the nitrates from beetroot just from a quick chew without having to take massive amount of liquids is an absolute game changer.
Yeah, I mean, I've sat on a toilet in Afghanistan just for like a day and a half while still eating 200 grams of beetroot because I was racing the next day, or having to, I mean, I'm sure we've got listeners who've had to drink a pint of beetroot extracts to try and get the correct level of nitrates before those little shot bottles came out, and knows what it does to your body. It's it's not always worth it.
Yeah, I've had some mixed experiences with those, so I'm not sure I could recommend them.
But yeah, I mean, this is the fun part of the job, is thinking how can we create something that actually is going to be usable, not just theoretically helpful, but actually something that day-to-day people can use. So yeah, any ideas? In fact, we're talking to a very good ultron at the moment who's got some very interesting ideas about new gels. And you know, if you do have an idea and you come to us, we'll make it for you, and we'll trial it, all that stuff. So do get in touch, because we're partly doing it because we just find it exciting, but also my friends are athletes, we're all runners, my community is athletes. It's just amazing to see things that help people, and actually setting new personal bests is inspiring and motivating, and all of that helps with that challenge of being healthy for life, basically.
Well, David, I have to say your product definitely is something that I use on a day-to-day basis and has definitely been a huge help. So for everyone listening, if they want to learn more about yourself, your product, anything like that, where can they find more information?
Well, I'm actually terrible at socials, so you can listen to our podcast. We've got something like 500 episodes. But there's half of them are interviews, half of them are chat about our day-to-day. Caffeinebullet.com. Our socials are very funny. Our Instagram, KC, super fun, but we do bring educational content there as well. And you'll find me on socials. I just don't post anything, but I do read messages, so feel free to drop me an Instagram or to message Bad Boy Running Podcast.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll definitely link all that in the show notes. If anyone wants to either comment in Spotify or message you directly with any new flavor ideas, it sounds like they're welcome to do so. I'll definitely throw in as well, for anyone listening, if you want to use the promo code RUNTOTHETOP, I believe that gets them 20% off as well. So awesome incentive.
Yeah, and hopefully, and we'll help support the community and the podcast, and everything you guys are about as well. So yeah, that's, if you are going to buy using that, and it means you're supporting the community that have been great enough to get us on here. So thank you very much for having us, Corey. It's been really fun. Absolutely, this was great. I learned so much about caffeine, and appreciate you joining the show with me. So thank you so much. My pleasure. That was ace. Thanks, Corey.